welcome to the second installment of the Advocata Institute's Deep Dive series. In this series, we bring to the table experts to explore and discuss current issues, and today's topic is on international trade and economic development. Today we have with us Dr. Sarath Rajapatirana, Academic Chair of the Advocata Institute. He brings with him extensive experience both from the World Bank and from the leading think tank, the American Enterprise Institute. Dr. Rajapatirana, thank you for joining us today. So Dr. Rajapatirana, can you tell me a little bit as to why you emphasize the use of trade theory when policymakers, especially in Sri Lanka, don't seem to give a lot of prominence to this?
Yeah, what you say is absolutely true. I believe it's because the orientation is to talk about policy without a good grounding in economic theory. Economic theory gives you a framework to ask questions. Otherwise, without defining your terms and without the knowledge of underlying theory, it's difficult to answer a question precisely. So if you have done the theory well, then you have a way of arranging your writing or your thought in a particular way that a person without the background would not be able to do. It will be like a number of random thoughts. Whereas the theory says you have a beginning, this is a question you ask, the answer is there in the theory if you care to frame it within that. And it's a very convenient way, and especially important for people who are in charge of formulating policies to be very clear about their theory. So that is the reason I emphasize. I also have seen people who have neglected theory, trying to answer a question without having some framework. I think the framework allows the reader and the listener and others to have a way of thinking about it. And that is what theory does.
Right.
Helps you to frame a question within a certain context.
So, Dr. Rajapatirana, building on what you just said, can you tell us a little bit about comparative advantage and the role it plays in decision making?
Yeah, comparative advantage discovered by David Ricardo in 1700s gives a way, he explains why trade can benefit both. If you take a two-country model, both countries can benefit. It's sort of a way of getting what is called a positive sum game. So if a country it produces even both goods compared to its trading partner at lower prices, still it makes sense to specialize. So, so shall we say his example was between England and France. France produces wine and wheat. US also, UK also produces, or England also produces wine and wheat. And even if say UK or England had the advantage to produce both at lower cost compared to the French, still both will benefit from it. This is a really interesting point that has been made. And it was even the great Adam Smith didn't see that. So what Ricardo started by reading Adam Smith on his way for a holiday, pick up the book called Wealth of Nations, and this came to him. And if it were done today, he won't be given not one but many Nobel Prizes. So when Professor Samuelson was asked by Ulam, the professor of physics at MIT, is there anything in your studies that is theoretically valid and true, irrespective of the circumstances? Yes, there is. It's called comparative advantage. And Ulam, the great physicist, agreed that yes, it does. Right. So it is a way of saying that countries produce goods for which they have a comparative advantage. That is at low prices, lower cost of production. And other countries also with low cost of production, even if they one country produces it both at lower price, still it makes benefits. There are gains on trade to have from that trade. And if I may say just one example, because comparative advantage applies not only to trade, various other things, right? So if there's a lawyer who is making, say, $800 a day, I'm just thing arbitrary, they make much more. $800 a day, and if he has to spend, so $100 an hour, he works for 8 hours. If he has to do everything by himself, he will not be maximizing his income. If you could hire a secretary who is paid half that amount a day, then by devoting that time to his lawyering, he will make more money and will be able to pay the secretary, and both will benefit. And that's very simple. Yeah.
So speaking on comparative advantage and how basically trade is beneficial to both parties.
Yes.
This is not something we see in conversations around trade in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
There's a lot of focus on whether we have a trade deficit with another country or whether we have a surplus with another country.
Yeah.
So building on what you've said, this isn't necessarily the best way to look at.
I think it is it's not a good way to look at it. And actually, in international trade, it doesn't matter. You can have deficit with anybody, but could be balanced with a surplus with somebody else, right? So if we can't say we have trade agreement with India, shall we say we have one? If you say they gain more before you export, they export to us, we gain less because we export, that is absolutely tosh. Law of comparative advantage, that is tosh. And particularly in international trade, India could have deficit with other countries, surplus with others, and vice versa. Right. It has no impact. You cannot make a welfare statement based on that. But comparative advantage tells you don't look at it that way. Yeah. And even now, for example, we will come to this later, I'm sure. Yes. If we can produce something at lower price, and obviously we will be exporting that. Compared to the rest of the world. If you have to produce at a higher cost, then we should not be producing. We can import it and have a residual that can be used for something else.
Okay, and so that idea that if you can't produce it for that lowest cost, you should just import it in.
Yes, absolutely.
Am I getting and understanding that correctly?
Yeah, that is, and people who don't seem to appreciate that say, let's do import substitution. But here's we may come to import substitution is in the Ricardian world or comparative advantage world says you are importing it because your costs are high. But that's exactly what we want to do. I mean, right? Yeah. That's what we want to do. Right. So that is the theory part, but the actual part shows that countries that have done that fail. Not only fail miserably. And they had to spend a lot of time getting back to it.
So Dr. Rajapatran, could you tell me a little bit more about the link between international trade and economic growth?
Yeah, that's a very close link. In terms of theory, exports are a part of GDP. So obviously, if you can increase export, then you increase GDP. That is a direct connection. But there's an indirect connection even more important. The fact that you are able to export something means that you are producing it at low cost. So that since GDP is value added, so we have high value added now in the sense that what you are exporting uses more of your abandon factor than if you were importing, or may not be importing at all this particular item, because there's some certain items that are both people export and import, particularly today because of the fragmentation of production, what is called global production networks. So when, for example, if we begin indiscriminately trying to increase import substitution, there are 2 points that need to be kept in mind. First of all, most of our exports, most countries, for example, depend on imports, right? The trade is much more fast, gone very fast in the last, say, 30 years in components. Just-in-time delivery, the Japanese introduced about 50 years ago. And so if you ban import, then you are banning part of the exports also, because exports are import dependent. So we are actually trading ultimately in value added, not the final goods. Once when I was doing a World Development Report, I asked Ford Motor Company to tell me how many countries they were importing parts in what is called Ford Export, the most popular car in the 1980s in the United States. 46 countries. Now today, I think that's double or treble that, because every little component matters. So if a country somewhere far away from the mainstream is able to produce some little widget lower cost than anybody else, it enters trade. So everybody is trading. So in other words, so if you are increasing your exports and you are more efficient, which is another way of saying you can do it, produce at lower cost, then you gain and your GDP will be high. Now that is the theory, but the practice, empirical part is much more impressive. So the Koreas, South Koreas of the world, the Singapores of the world, now Vietnams of the world, now Bangladesh of the world have discovered that and doing it. So they are allowing comparative advantage to determine. It is no longer some government bureaucrat sitting in an air-conditioned office 10 floors above this making decisions what to export and import. It's done by the market. Particularly exporting and importing activities are market-driven. They are best done by the market. Now there are some exceptions like fuel, by many of the oil exporters and want to handle that. That's an exception case. That they want to capture the stuff to control the economies, right? So it is true for Indonesia, for example, great oil exporter, Saudi Arabia, all those exporters. But generally, exports and imports undertaken by the private sector. So if you are not very accommodative of the private sector, what you want to do, then you will have low growth, and we're seeing that.
So I'd like to divert a little bit from our current topic, and let's jump in there a little bit later.
Please do.
You speak a lot about the difference between mainstream economists and non-mainstream economists.
Yeah, I have to say this is somewhat arbitrary, but I have a way of defining it that I have thought about it. If you take a standard advanced text in economics and look at the index and ask who is being cited there, many times than anybody else. And if you give a name of a so-called non-mainstream, I have given name of Chang and Danny Roderick, who are good economists, but they are contrarian. They have different views from what we are talking about. Those people who are very comfortable with economic theory, are well known for their empirical work, are my judgment, they are mainstream economists. The non-mainstream economists are people occupy a small part of that area, and they give something very different from comparative advantage. You would say Chang Hoon, who is against capitalism, says comparative advantage does not work, but he cannot produce empirical evidence. He can make the statement, but you can see country after country who liberalize their economic regimes, including us, right? We can show that after they did that, after they allowed the private sector, the countries to liberalize the system, meaning allowing prices to allocate resources, only that, they have done very well. I mean, look at China. China is a good example that they don't want to cite. China liberalized. China's regime is more liberal than many other countries, some European countries, and doing so well, growing for 40 years at 10% and now becoming very soon to become the largest GDP country in the world. I don't know what that means, but in terms of welfare, it doesn't mean very much. But in terms of size of the economy, China is already in purchasing power parity terms, is as a higher GDP in most countries. Probably US is the number one and China second, but fast coming. And some people argue and say the next country is not going to be, the second country is going to be India. and that will happen. So it is very closely, the trade policy that you follow is very closely related to economic to growth, not only in theory, but we notice in practice also.
So Sri Lanka has had its fair share of experience in this area. Could you speak a little bit about the experience Sri Lanka's economy had pre-liberalization and post-liberalization?
Yeah, actually, we are very fortunate this way that we have example, our own example. We can look at the world and say the countries who liberalize their economies have grown faster. Then we can come our own history and say the country that liberalized second in the world, developing country in the world, after Chile did in 74, we did in 77, grew very fast. And why did we go very fast? Now the choice is being made by the government, let go and allow prices to allocate resources. Private sector come there. There are a lot of foreign investment. There are industrial zones created, and a lot of progress made. We have not matched that 7 years between 1977 and say 83. Fast growth compared to any other period. And I have to say, sadly, 70 to 77 is the worst period in our economic history. Nobody can deny that. There's one incident where in 2011, GDP actually was negative for the first time. That was because of a huge drought, not because of any economic policy problem. So we can learn not only from the rest of the world and from our own experience. So economists who are looking at this, do this in terms of what the experience of the rest of the world. You see, because in economics we don't have a control experiment. We can go to a laboratory and set it up and see whether something works or not. No, because now it's a social science. Society is involved in it. So one of the things that we have finally to look at the truth of some statement in economics is through looking at what other countries done, comparative analysis. And so even that will indicate us in this direction that countries that allowed export and imports to take place based on their relative prices did very well.
So to move more into the present day, right now the government is pursuing a strategy of import substitution as a solution to our developmental and economic woes at present. What are your thoughts on that?
I am very concerned, worried that we are trying to repeat our bad history. When we in 1977 to 77, this country tried that experiment. That we have seen the movie, not only in our country but others also. Simple fact is that a small country like ours with a low resource base have to be engaged with the rest of the world. Or we are not against efficient import substitution. Import substitution that is supported by government banning certain items without allowing prices to allocate, that is the one that really creates problem for us. So in ideal world, where we are a bit far away from now, we want to give equal emphasis to efficient import substitution and efficient export policy. Actually, export policy has to be efficient because nobody will buy your good. But in order to be able to convert, say, good that we have been importing into an export, well, you have to do a lot of things. They have to be able to increase efficiency, reduce cost. That is okay. Actually, at the end of the day, the frontline mainstreamers like Bhagwati and Ann Krieger, Ian Little, T.N. Srinivasan, they are people who said, well, look at the domestic resources we are using, producing one good for import substitution, vis-a-vis the cost of you are incurring in order to export something. If they are roughly alike, not necessarily identical, if alike, then we have allocated our resources as well. And we have seen that in the case of the East Asian countries grew so fast, not because very clever governments were able to see, to promote things in advance, but were going to be increase in demand in the future, but because they allow prices to allocate. And they supported companies that were following that line. So in the case of Korea, when they found that private sector had done well, even building ships, they supported it. They allowed them to have credit. They did not intervene after that, knowing that these people know what they are doing. So when the government comes in and says you should produce good A rather than good B, you can ask what is the basis of your agreement. Is it low cost? If it is low cost, why didn't we do it before? What has changed in order to go and do it? Now also, one of the things that we should discuss at this point, actually at least state, is what's called Hertzsche-Ohlin theorem. Hertzsche-Ohlin says, very simple idea, that countries will export goods for which it has abundance of resources and import goods for which has relatively less abundance. So when you look at our exports and imports, we should be able to decipher whether our competitive advantage, abundance, is actually labor. Now, educated labor on our side than compared to other countries in Asia. So, why don't we let that happen? Why don't we let it happen? And now, of course, on the export side, you can't subsidize exports. If you subsidize exports, you fall foul of the WTO rules. So, there's no reason to say that you should be producing this in our country. We are wasting resources then. This is a little bit difficult to understand for some people. Why we are producing, they are very proud, we are producing. But that is, we are producing at what cost? We are giving up the benefit of trade by doing this. And we can ask the question, why didn't we do this before? Obviously, we didn't have comparative advantage in it. If we have, then show us that we have comparative. Now we have the case of the recent banning of, I've forgotten the...
turmeric?
Turmeric. Yeah. Turmeric. So we banned turmeric. Prices shot up. Went to 750 rupees a kilo or something like that. And in that order. Then what did we do? We asked the army to do it. The army is being paid by the government. So farmers that would have benefited from it didn't get that chance. So anyway, why did we have to? Listen, could anybody get up and say we are going to do import and turmeric because it's beneficial? In what sense? Is it cost basis? What is the basis on which we can say turmeric and not something else? And who chose it? I want the turmeric to be chosen by the private sector people. Then we take the risk and we produce it. If we fail, then that's a very important thing to have for the people. The price, the profit and loss way of looking at it is the best way of looking at it. Because if a public servant makes that decision, I can tell you, as being a public servant for 4 years, I don't count my central bank career there, because, right? I'll be a terrible choice for anybody to say, decide what to import. I go face, no, I can't do that. I have no basis to do it. So only way we have for countries like us, small countries, is to follow comparative advantage.
So an argument which you mentioned briefly was that is brought out is that import substitution is being pursued for the benefit of domestic industries, and that domestic industries will then thrive and we will see economic growth under these conditions.
If domestic industries can try and they can get all the power to them, I say, fine, do it. But the thing is that it has to be, why didn't, I asked this question, why didn't our private sector jump into the turmeric business before? Why? What kept them away? What is it that has changed so much in order for the government to do it and misallocate? Turmeric may not be the best example, but if we do it, like we can do in motor cars, ridiculous motor cars. We produce motor cars, maybe 20 cars in 6 months or even less than. And we don't have we have great competitive advantage in producing components for cars. But trying to produce equivalent of a BMW, where we produce the rubber this thing for the wiper, is the best thing we can do. But the thing is that we are not going to stay there. We are not going to stay there in the sense that competitive advantage changes. For example, China has a lot of competitive advantage in making components. The Apple phone, iPhone is being produced in China. But China's contribution is less than 3%, right? But even with 3%, it made about 5-6 years ago $9 billion of, But what are the components come from? United States, design, Taiwan for this thing, Japan for the battery, all those things, and everybody benefits. So why can't we join that global production network rather than worried about a little thing called turmeric?
True. So right now, Sri Lanka is facing rather difficult circumstances, shall we say, on the macroeconomic side.
Yes.
We have high debt, there is concern on the depreciation of the rupee. How does trade policy fit into this?
Yeah, first of all, of course, there are, in order to repay our debt. So we don't have really, when people say debt problem, we don't have a debt problem as such. We have a debt repayment problem, right? Number one. Number two is that if the debt that we have got borrowed were to have been used well to get a higher return, then we would not be having this problem. So, I have said this before, very important countries in the world today, United States borrowed from small Holland in the 18th century, right? 18th century. And they paid off the debt. And so it is really depends on what you use the debt for. And so obviously we didn't use the debt properly, that's why we have a problem. Our imports are 3 times our exports. Now that is more the macroeconomic problem than trade problem. Most trade problems unfortunately end up as a macroeconomic problem. So poor trade policies, when you are taxing we are protecting imports. And therefore creating a biseconds exports. So very simple argument. Even if you didn't have a single component in your export, supposing it's all produced here, shall we say, still if you do import substitution by banning and raising the prices and increase profitability, where do you think resources are going to go after that? They are not going to go to the export, they are going to the import substitution. So then we can't be complaining and saying, oh, we don't have enough, we have a big trade deficit. We created it by bad policy. So they have to go along together. Bad macroeconomic policy will really completely disable trade policy. So you have to have good macroeconomic policy. Only 2 indicators. First of all, keep inflation low, close to your, not zero, but close to what your trading partners are having. And 2, have a sustainable current account deficit. If those 2 things are there, then you have a stable economy. So what does that mean? Is that people who want to invest their money, whether they be foreign direct investment or local investors, they'll be then investing in a more stable environment. So when there's uncertainty today about our repayment, various stories people begin to say, correct and sometimes terribly incorrect, tells us the amount of uncertainty there is. So I won't be surprised if our foreign direct investment is only 1% of GDP now. Whereas, countries that I worked on before, Vietnam is about 25%. Even Bangladesh, because it provides a good environment to people to invest.
So, right now with this macroeconomic situation, there is further conversation happening on the role of our exchange rate in trade policy. And the idea that it must be maintained at certain levels in order to be beneficial. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's an entirely wrong way to look at it. Nobody can say we have an exchange rate policy is going to be this amount. It can be only determined in the market. If when somebody says, I know what the exchange rate is going to be next month, I will challenge the person, how do you know? What is the basis? Without having supply and demand, you can't know what the exchange rate, equilibrating exchange rate is going to be. Right? But we know that if you allow the exchange rate to depreciate, that is the market is doing. We are not doing. If you didn't interfere in the market in a violent way, if people make their transactions, there will be some point at which the exchange rate equilibrates these things, demand for foreign exchange and supply of foreign exchange, right? So, in fact, if you want to change exchange rate for some reason, outside the market-based exchange rate, I'll be very worried about it. But that is what we had in the past. We had a fixed exchange rate, fixed nominal rate. We can never have a fixed real exchange rate, with nominal rate. And then we allow supply and demand to accommodate itself. We had what is called a currency board system, you know, up to the time we had the central bank in 1949. So in that case, instead of prices adjusting, then supply and demand adjust. But that requires so much. Our labor markets must be flexible. You know, there are so many. We must have banking system that can support it, private banking system that can support it. But there's no way today we can have a currency board type of system, although some people are still arguing for it. I wrote a paper in 2000, HAT is going to take a lecture, where I believe I should say we can no longer do this because we don't have the flexibility of prices that obtain them.
So Dr. Rajabhadrana, could you tell me a little bit about what factors you feel affect export performance, either good or bad?
Yeah, I'll begin by saying certainly it's not what's outside. You know, there was a survey that the International Trade Center did in 2010. I was advisor to that team. And we did in the survey, 70% of respondents out of the 500 firms that we surveyed said, our problems are not outside, it's here. So in order to produce something, get it to the port, needs so many steps in Sri Lanka. Right. Sometimes very duplicative, right? So for example, supposing we are producing something has a little piece of wood in it, we have to ask forestry people. And if we have to something else, we have to ask the health people. It's also like that. So also, I have to say this, that every time you give a right to a public official in this country or other, that's same, there's an opportunity for them to get involved in that transaction. We call it illegal payments, that are another word to it I'm not going to use. So that is the problem. So if you are exporting something, there is a private arrangement that that you have to make some illegal payment to get it out of the thing. Same way when you want to clear something. So in certain countries like Brazil, they have what they call facilitators. This is what they do. They have people who have, like business people, the only thing is they're facilitating. Why do they need facilitate? Because public laws are so, you know, difficult to deal with. People develop their friendship with the officials and they say, don't worry, I'll help you, and that's how they facilitate it. By looking at the person, by the income of the facilitator, you know the amount of illegal payment that are being made, right? So the more difficult you make it to import something, export something, the more opportunities you create for people to make money off that. Now, export is a very competitive business. 2-3% off, you might lose the market. So therefore, you know, you cannot afford to have these, the various constraints put on a transaction. So exports, rest of the world exports, we are such a small country, you know. Our exports, if I remember right, last year was about, out of total exports in the world, about 0.6%, something like that, right? That is less than what we were having in the 1970s. Whereas the rest of our neighbors have done so well, we have stuck there. Why? So we should be looking at both. I think it would be a mistake to look at only one side. We have to look at both exports and imports and see the connection between the two. And also they are very, as we discussed, they are very closely related. The economic theory shows that what's called Lerner symmetry theorem. a duty on import is a tax on exports. You know, when he did it, you have some relationship to that. He was at LSE as a night-time student when he said he saw this symmetry. And he also proved the factor price equalization that Samuelson has proved when he was a student, when Lerner was a student. So these are, you know, things that are uncontestable. We know that is true.
So, when it comes to trade policy, there's generally seems to be kind of two schools of thought, either an outward-oriented or an inward-oriented. Looking at Sri Lanka, where do you think we are?
Yeah, I think that I want to start from the statement that outward-oriented far left behind the other side, okay? What do you mean by outward-oriented? Mean by outward-oriented where the incentives for export promotion, where you earn foreign exchange, and the incentives for import substitution where you save foreign exchange. I use the word save within inverted commas, save foreign exchange, are balanced. Okay? That is outward oriented. It is badly defined at the beginning by the progenitors of the idea, including Professor Krieger. They were also about export, but actually they are same, both. The balancing that both items is outward orientation, not favoring anything. So I think that if you look at the countries, we'll take an example of, say, there are some 198 countries in the world. Let's take example 30% as statisticians do, and array them and say where are the most successful. We measure it by, say, their trade to GDP ratio have been the flying fastest, and it will be countries that are following outward oriented policies. East Asian economies were doing that. Yeah.
So, as a final question, area of trade that is often very publicly contested is that of free trade agreements.
Yeah.
And there is divided opinion as to whether free trade agreements are a good idea or not. And quite often, the divided opinion itself comes from very different sources. You have people taking to the streets. You have a more academic argument against it as well. Yeah. And then you have very strong proponents for free trade agreements.
Yeah. First of all, I like to say this at the beginning. Free trade agreements are not free trade. Okay? Free trade is where the interference of the government is minimized. Free trade, I will call it unrestricted trade rather than free trade. So, so when countries, so we have free trade agreements with India, Pakistan, and now Singapore, right? If you look at their performance, India is the oldest one. The question is that our trade outside these agreements have been greater and faster than within the agreement, number one. The main problem is that there is what is called rules of origin, basically, main problem. That is, whenever you have an agreement, you have to have the provision that nobody else exports for you and then you re-export it. To prevent it, you can say you are eligible to the concessions that the Indians are giving us because to prevent, say, Vietnam from selling coffee through us or some other product, even for that matter, turmeric, shall we say, yeah, right. So in order to prevent that, you can say you are eligible for the concessions under the free trade agreement only if your output is more than 25% domestic, not otherwise, right? That's number one. Now, I was working on Latin America in the time they were signing the agreement between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. And so somebody said free trade is 2 words, but this agreement said 2,000 pages of law being used. So the North American Free Trade Area, NAFTA. Okay? So we learned from that experience. Do you know now the exporters from Mexico don't want to go through the agreement? Because it's cheaper for them to go straight without asking for the concession. So it's more than the cost of doing that. It's now more than but they private individuals to transport and do those things. So unfortunately, there has been a sort of political division on this, very sadly. India is very important to us. India has to be our friends all the time. I mean, we are partly, most of our things, the Buddhism, our genes, everything comes from India. So we are, in a way, we have to be very good friends with India. And it will be not very helpful if we are not. And the agreements are partly, they are not only economic, they are political agreements also. I mean, this world has both politics and economics, you can't isolate one. So that agreement has worked to some extent. It has not really got the best out of it. Maybe there are problems, for example, if you are exporting goods to India, what the trade agreement says to give free passage, but it can get stuck in some southern states in India. It has happened. So that agreement signed in Delhi not always honored in terms of clearances and things like that. The third item is that what I call if you have a dispute settlement system, it's not worked very well. We should have dispute settlement in the case if there's an inordinate delay, we should be able to appeal to that and say, look, we are trying to export strawberries for heaven's sake. You can't hold it for a week. We are done. So there are some practical things also. Now my last comment is on Singapore. Now there are a lot of objections to Singapore agreement. I think to me that was very ill-considered. Why? Because Singapore is one of the world's freest trade regimes in the world, zero tariff. Okay, so we are not going to get any benefits in terms of zero tariff. We are already there are no tariff, but we were latching our name to one of the freest trade countries in the world and establishing our credentials. Say we are for free trade. True, right? But the Singapore case is because if we had an agreement with India. With Singapore, in this case, then people who are trading with us know, hey, we have this agreement with a country that is very open. And so that would help other people, Singaporeans included, to come and invest there because we have agreement. Unfortunately, from people from the very top to the bottom at various stages objected to it. But the Singaporeans said, we had provision in that agreement. To reconsider various things, and we did, and it was very sad what happened, very sad. People who had no idea about the economics were prominently marching against it, and supported by some people who are very high up in the system also. So we didn't do very well with Singapore.
Right. Okay.
I wish we could say something much nice about that.
But unfortunately.
Right.
Thank you, Dr. Rajapathirana, for sharing your insights with us today. If you would like to join in on this discussion, the Advocata Institute will be hosting a panel discussion bringing together international and local experts on this topic. Follow our social media pages to stay updated. If you would like to watch the first installment of the Advocata Institute's Deep Dive series, which was on debt sustainability, do follow our YouTube channel.